On a warm summer afternoon, the grand hall was filled with excitement. It was the day of the wedding, and everyone had gathered to celebrate the union of two people deeply in love. The bride, dressed in an elegant white gown, glowed as she greeted her guests. Her family and friends, all beautifully dressed, chatted in groups, some admiring the lavish decorations that adorned the hall, while others admired the beauty of the bride and the joy that filled the air. The groom, standing tall in a sharp tuxedo, exchanged laughs and well wishes with his friends. The guests were excited, waiting for the ceremony to begin, and the atmosphere was filled with warmth, joy, and the sweet sound of wedding bells in the background. The venue itself was magnificent. The tables were draped with white linen and decorated with delicate flowers that filled the room with their subtle fragrance. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow on the faces of the guests below. In the center of the room stood a massive cake, towering high with layers of frosting and intricate designs that made it look like something out of a fairy tale. Everyone couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder as they gazed around the room. It was a perfect moment, one of those rare occasions that would stay in the hearts of everyone present for years to come. Outside the venue, however, things were much different. A man, worn and ragged, stood at the corner of the street. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and messy, and his face had the signs of a life lived on the streets. He looked down at his shoes, which were nearly falling apart, then up at the grand wedding taking place just a few steps away. Something about the celebration caught his eye. The laughter, the happiness, the love that seemed to fill the air. He had seen so little of that in his own life, and for a moment, he felt a deep longing in his heart. He stood still, observing the bright smiles of the people entering the venue, feeling like an outsider. The homeless man wasn't sure why he even thought about going inside. It wasn't like he had a place there, and he certainly wasn't invited. But as he stood there, something inside him urged him to move closer. He slowly walked to the back of the hall, where the entrance was less guarded. His steps were quiet, almost hesitant, but before he knew it, he was inside. It was as if the sounds of the celebration were calling to him, pulling him in. He looked around nervously, trying not to attract attention. There were too many people, and he didn't belong here, but somehow he couldn't stop himself from slipping into the crowd. No one paid much attention to him at first. The wedding was already underway, and all eyes were on the couple as they exchanged their vows. The man stood by a corner of the room, watching the ceremony, his heart heavy with mixed emotions. There was joy around him, but there was also a deep loneliness that he couldn't shake. He wondered what it must feel like to be part of something so beautiful, to be surrounded by so much love and hope. It was a feeling he couldn't quite grasp, but one that he desperately longed for. As the ceremony went on, the man remained at the edge, trying to stay unnoticed. But his presence didn't go completely undetected. Some guests exchanged curious glances, whispering to one another. Who was he? Why was he here? Security, noticing the stranger in the room, began to approach him. But the homeless man, still quietly observing the celebration, felt a sudden urge, an urge he couldn't explain, to do something, to be heard. For reasons he couldn't understand, he knew that this moment was important, and he was about to do something that would leave everyone in the room stunned. The quiet moment before the storm, the feeling of being out of place, the longing in his heart, all of it led up to one incredible decision. The wedding continued, with the guests enjoying the festivities, but there was a growing sense of curiosity around the homeless man who had quietly entered the hall. He was now standing near the back, his eyes wandering across the room, taking in every detail. The sound of laughter and music filled the air, and the man couldn't help but feel a strange mix of happiness and sadness. He saw families gathered together, friends sharing moments of joy, and couples exchanging loving glances. It was a world he barely recognized, one filled with connection, something he hadn't experienced in years. He stayed out of sight, trying not to draw attention to himself, but there was something about the celebration that felt magnetic. His feet seemed to move on their own, quietly carrying him closer to the center of the room. As he walked, his eyes landed on the microphone stand on the stage. His heart raced, and a strange impulse washed over him. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a sudden need to speak, to share something that had been bubbling up inside him for a long time. Without even thinking, he found himself approaching the stage. At first, the guests didn't notice him. They were all lost in the happiness of the moment, their attention focused on the bride and groom. The homeless man's footsteps were soft, barely audible as he moved toward the microphone. But as he reached the stage, the security guard, who had been keeping a watchful eye on him, noticed his intentions. The guard moved in his direction, trying to stop him before he could cause any disruption. He wasn't sure what this man was doing there, and his first instinct was to remove him from the celebration. However, before the security guard could reach him, the homeless man did something unexpected. With a swift but determined motion, he reached for the microphone. He grabbed it firmly, his hands shaking slightly, but his resolve was clear. He didn't look around the room to check if anyone was watching him. He didn't need to. His eyes were fixed on the mic, his fingers gripping it with a quiet strength. The guard, standing just a few feet away, hesitated. He was unsure whether to intervene or wait, as the man didn't seem to be threatening anyone, just holding the microphone like he belonged there. The room fell into an uneasy silence as the man stood there, the microphone in his hand. A few guests turned their heads, noticing the strange figure standing on stage. They weren't sure what to make of it. Was he part of the entertainment? Was he a guest who had somehow been overlooked? Some looked at each other, whispering, while others simply stared, waiting to see what would happen next. The homeless man stood frozen for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, unsure of how to begin. It was a strange and unexpected moment, but in that silence, he felt the weight of the room's attention on him, and it both unnerved and encouraged him. The guests had no idea what to expect next. They whispered among themselves, but the man stood there, unwavering, the microphone still in his hand. There was a tension in the air as the crowd awaited what he might say. Everyone was curious, some even worried that things would take a strange turn. Yet the man, despite his rough appearance, seemed as if he had something important to say. What could a homeless man possibly add to a wedding celebration? Was it just a mistake, or was there something more to this unexpected intrusion? His next move would change everything. The room was filled with a tense silence as the homeless man stood there, gripping the microphone. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, some whispering to one another, while others stared at him with a mix of confusion and curiosity. The groom and bride, who were dancing on the other side of the room, had no idea what was happening. The music had stopped, and the soft chatter of the crowd faded into a hush as all eyes turned toward the stage. It was clear that something unusual was happening, but no one could figure out exactly what it was. The homeless man stood still, his hands trembling slightly around the mic. He didn't look nervous in the way most would expect, though. There was a quiet determination in his eyes. For a moment, he was just looking at the crowd, almost as if he were searching for something. The silence stretched on, and people began to grow more uncomfortable. They didn't know if they should laugh it off, ask him to leave, or wait to see if he was going to say something meaningful. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally took a deep breath and stepped closer to the microphone. His voice was soft at first, unsure, but when he spoke, there was a clarity to his words that caught everyone off guard. It wasn't the voice of someone shouting for attention or causing a scene. It was a voice that carried a depth of experience, of someone who had lived through hardship and come out the other side with a story to tell. The guests were still unsure of what to expect, but his voice seemed to have a calming effect, drawing everyone's attention fully to him. Love, the homeless man began, his voice steady now, is something we all seek. Whether we're rich or poor, happy or sad, love is what we all need. He paused, and the guests, still unsure, listened intently. The man's eyes wandered from face to face, and for the first time, He seemed to feel connected to the people around him. There was something about the moment, the way he stood there, speaking to strangers who had no idea who he was, that made him feel like he was finally being seen. "I know I'm not like most people here," he continued, glancing down at his worn clothes. "I don't have the fancy suits or the nice shoes. I don't have the comfort of a warm home or the safety of knowing where my next meal will come from. But what I do have is something that all of you have too, and that's the ability to love, to care, to connect." His words carried weight, and the guests began to shift in their seats, no longer looking at him with suspicion, but with something else: understanding, maybe even respect. The man's words struck a chord with those listening. He spoke with a sincerity that was rare, a kind of truth that could only come from someone who had truly lived through struggle. His next words were soft but powerful. "I don't need to be part of your world to know what matters. You have something precious here, a love that's real. Don't ever take it for granted." He looked directly at the bride and groom, who were now standing near the front, watching him with wide eyes. They weren't sure what to make of this sudden interruption, but the sincerity in the man's voice made them pause. There was something about the way he spoke that made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a speech, it was an offering, a reminder that love was the one thing that could bind them all together, no matter where they came from or what they had. The homeless man, standing before a room full of strangers, had somehow managed to capture the heart of the moment. The tension in the room began to fade as his message began to sink in. His words weren't just for the bride and groom, they were for everyone in the room. And despite the unexpectedness of it all, it was a message that everyone needed to hear. As the homeless man finished speaking, a deep silence filled the room. No one knew exactly how to respond. The words he had just spoken were not what anyone had expected at a wedding. The guests had been waiting for the usual speeches, the jokes, and the celebratory toasts. But this man, a complete stranger, had interrupted their carefully planned event with a powerful message about love, connection, and the things that truly matter in life. For a moment, no one moved. Some guests exchanged glances, others simply stood frozen, processing what they had just heard. The bride and groom stood there too, their hands clasped together as they watched the man on stage. The groom's face was slightly flushed, not from anger, but from the rawness of the speech he had just heard. His heart, too, seemed to feel the weight of the words. The bride, standing next to him, looked as though she had just been touched by something deeply personal. There were tears in her eyes, tears of recognition, perhaps, or simply the deep emotion of the moment. The homeless man didn't look at anyone now. His eyes were focused on the floor, almost as if he were embarrassed by the attention he had drawn. He seemed to shrink into himself, as though his mission was complete. He wasn't seeking applause, praise, or even sympathy. He had simply spoken from the heart, as if it was the most important thing he could do at that moment. It was then that the bride, still wiping her eyes, stepped forward. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Thank you." Her words were simple but heartfelt, and they carried the sincerity of someone who had truly been moved. "You didn't have to do that, but I'm glad you did." The guests watched quietly, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The groom, standing next to his bride, nodded in agreement, his expression serious, but touched by what the man had shared. Without hesitation, the groom stepped up to the man, his hand extended. "I don't know who you are, but thank you for reminding us of what's really important," he said, his voice filled with warmth. The homeless man looked at the groom's hand for a moment, then slowly shook it. It wasn't just a handshake. It was a moment of shared understanding, a connection that transcended the boundaries of wealth, status, or background. In that simple gesture, the man felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. The guests, seeing this unexpected display of kindness, began to relax. Some of them stood and began to clap, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for the homeless man's words. The applause spread slowly at first, hesitant, unsure, but soon it grew louder. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was enough to show the man that his message had been heard. That simple act of stepping up to speak, to share his heart with a room full of strangers, had left a mark on everyone in the room. The man, still holding the microphone, looked out over the crowd. His eyes were misty, and for a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: appreciation. It was a humbling experience, one that made him realize that, even in his most vulnerable moments, he still had something to offer. He wasn't just a homeless man standing in a wedding hall. He was someone who had been given the chance to speak, and his words had found a place in people's hearts. With a final glance at the bride and groom, the homeless man gave a small, appreciative nod before slowly stepping away from the microphone. He turned and started to walk toward the exit, but not before hearing the soft murmurs of approval and the continued applause behind him. The room that had once been filled with confusion and unease now felt lighter, as if the air itself had shifted. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a moment that had connected everyone in the room, reminding them of what truly matters. As the homeless man made his way toward the exit, the room was still buzzing with emotion. The applause that had once seemed hesitant was now genuine, warm, and filled with admiration. Guests were talking quietly to one another, sharing their thoughts about the unexpected interruption. Some were still processing the words he had spoken, while others were moved by the way he had expressed something so simple yet so profound. The bride and groom, still standing near the stage, exchanged a look. There was a moment of silence between them, as if they were both trying to absorb the depth of what had just happened. For a few seconds, neither of them knew what to say. It wasn't the wedding they had planned, but it was a wedding that would be remembered for far more than just the ceremony. The bride smiled softly at the groom, her eyes still wet from the tears that had been brought on by the homeless man's speech. "I think he gave us something we'll remember forever," she said, her voice full of warmth and sincerity. The groom nodded. "He reminded us of what really matters," he said, his words filled with a sense of quiet gratitude. "In all the excitement of the day, we can sometimes forget the most important things." He turned to look at the man who had so suddenly, and so dramatically, entered their lives. The homeless man was now at the door, about to leave. The groom's gaze lingered for a moment before he turned back to the bride. Guests were still talking, and many of them were beginning to approach the couple to offer their thoughts. There was a sense of unity in the air that hadn't been there before. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about the unexpected lesson they had all learned. The homeless man's words had shaken them all awake, reminding them of the power of love, connection, and living in the moment. It wasn't just a reminder to the bride and groom, but to everyone in that room. As the man stepped out of the hall and into the bright afternoon sunlight, he took a deep breath. He had said what he needed to say, and in doing so, he had left an impression on a room full of strangers. He wasn't sure if he would ever see any of them again, but in that brief moment, he had connected with them in a way that was more meaningful than he could have imagined. He wasn't just a figure of pity or someone to be avoided. He was a human being, just like anyone else, with something important to share. The air outside felt different. It was as if the weight of the world had lifted off his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. The wedding had been a reminder for him too, not of the things he didn't have, but of the things he could still offer. He may have been homeless, but he was far from invisible. Back inside the wedding hall, the mood had shifted. The celebration continued, but the atmosphere was richer now, filled with a sense of depth. People were more connected, their conversations deeper, their laughter more genuine. It wasn't just about the food or the music. It was about the human experience, the simple act of being together, of sharing in one another's lives. The homeless man's words had grounded everyone in a way that nothing else could have. As the evening wore on, people couldn't stop talking about the unexpected guest who had stolen the show. Some even joked that he had given the best speech of the day. But beneath the lighthearted comments, there was an underlying respect for what he had done. He hadn't come there looking for recognition. He hadn't come there to cause a scene. He had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, he had touched the hearts of everyone in that room. And for that, his presence would never be forgotten. The evening continued, but the events of the day stayed fresh in everyone's mind. People whispered about the homeless man who had crashed the wedding, but their tone had shifted from confusion to something much deeper. No longer was he seen as an intruder or someone who didn't belong. Now he was remembered as someone who had brought something priceless to the celebration, a moment of true reflection. His words about love and human connection had left a lasting impact on the bride, groom, and every guest in the room. As the night went on, the bride and groom found themselves speaking to their guests in a new way. They thanked them for coming, but there was a newfound depth in their conversations. Guests were more engaged, more present, and perhaps more grateful for the opportunity to be together. The small talk and casual chatter that usually filled such gatherings felt different now. People talked more openly about their lives, about their struggles, and about what they valued most. The spirit of the wedding had shifted from just a celebration of love between two people to a celebration of love as something that connects all people. One by one, the guests came up to the bride and groom, sharing their own thoughts about the speech. Most were still in awe of how such simple words could have such a powerful effect. "He really made me think about the way I see the world," one guest said, wiping away a tear. "It's easy to get caught up in the little things, the things that seem important, but his message reminded me that love is the most important thing." Others nodded in agreement, reflecting on how they'd often forgotten that in their busy lives. There were murmurs of gratitude from the older guests, who recognized the timeless truth in the man's speech. The bride, still slightly emotional, smiled as she listened to everyone's words. "It's strange," she said softly, "how a wedding can remind you of everything that really matters. I thought today would be about us, about our new beginning. But now I realize it's about the love we share with everyone around us." The groom, standing beside her, squeezed her hand. "It's funny how life works out sometimes," he said. "Here we were, having our perfect day, and then a stranger walks in and gives us something we'll never forget." As the evening drew to a close, people began to leave, but the mood had undeniably changed. The guests were no longer just going home after a party. They were leaving with something more, something that would stay with them long after the night ended. People were more aware of the connections they shared with others, more willing to cherish their relationships, and more appreciative of the small, quiet moments that often go unnoticed in the hustle of everyday life. The homeless man, though long gone from the wedding, had left a mark that no one would ever forget. His speech had been a brief interruption, but it was one that altered the course of the evening. The bride and groom, who had planned for their wedding to be the most memorable day of their lives, now understood that what made it truly unforgettable wasn't the cake, the decorations, or the gifts. It was the reminder that love is what holds everything together. Weeks later, when guests spoke about the wedding, it wasn't the grand hall or the elegant reception they remembered. It was the homeless man's unexpected speech and how it had made them reflect on their own lives. People would recount the story with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Some even said it was the best part of the whole day. The bride and groom, now married, often found themselves smiling at the memory of how a simple moment with a stranger had turned their wedding into something much deeper than they ever could have imagined. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a lesson in love, in connection, and in the power of a few simple words. And as they moved forward in their new life together, the couple made a promise to never forget the lessons learned from that unexpected, unforgettable moment. As the days passed after the wedding, the memory of the homeless man's unexpected speech lingered in the minds of the bride, the groom, and their guests. It was a moment that seemed to transcend the ordinary, something that none of them had expected, but all of them would remember forever. It was as if the wedding had given them a glimpse into something deeper, something that many people go through life never truly understanding. The bride and groom, now settling into married life, often found themselves reflecting on the events of their big day. They spoke about it together, remembering how the man had interrupted their celebration. At first, they had been unsure of what to make of it, but now they both agreed it had been one of the most important moments of their wedding. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a stranger," the bride admitted one evening, as they sat in their living room. "He made me realize how easy it is to forget what really matters. We get so caught up in our own world, in our plans and dreams, that we forget there's a bigger picture out there." The groom, nodding in agreement, responded, "I've been thinking the same thing." His words really hit me. It's easy to take things for granted, but he reminded us that love, connection, and being present with others is the real gift. The couple's bond grew stronger, not just because of the love they shared for each other, but because of the way they had learned to appreciate the people around them, and even the unexpected moments that life threw their way. The guests who had attended the wedding were also reflecting on the homeless man's words. The man had not only interrupted their celebration, but had left them all with a deeper understanding of love, human connection, and what truly matters. Some of them reached out to the bride and groom in the following weeks, sharing how the speech had made them rethink their relationships and priorities. "You know," one guest said during a follow-up conversation, "I've been reconnecting with old friends I hadn't spoken to in years." His speech made me realize how important those relationships are. "I never thought a wedding would lead to something like this." Others shared similar stories. One guest had called her mother, whom she had been distant from for months, and apologized for the time they had lost. "I thought I was too busy with work, with my life," she explained. "But after hearing that man, I realized I had been taking the people who loved me for granted. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen again." It was clear that the homeless man had planted a seed of reflection in everyone who had heard his speech. Even some of the children who had attended the wedding spoke about it, sharing their thoughts about what the man had said. The simple yet powerful message of love and connection resonated with them as well. "He said love is important, right?" one young girl asked her parents. "Then I'm going to tell my friends I love them more often." It was heartwarming to see how even the youngest guests had internalized the man's message and carried it forward in their own lives. As time went on, the bride and groom, now more mindful of the connections they had with others, began to make more of an effort to reach out to people they had lost touch with. They didn't want to wait until something extraordinary happened to remind them of the importance of love and connection. They made it a point to check in on their friends and family regularly, to send messages of appreciation, and to make the time for what truly mattered. They both agreed that the homeless man, despite his rough exterior, had given them a priceless gift. His words had been simple but profound, and they had sparked a change in the way they saw the world. It wasn't about material wealth, status, or outward appearances. It was about love, about being present with the people around you, and about remembering that the most valuable things in life were often the ones we overlooked. In the end, the bride and groom were grateful for that unexpected interruption at their wedding. It had not only shaped their celebration, but had also shaped their lives in ways they never could have predicted. They understood now that love wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday moments of connection that made life worth living. And they would carry that lesson with them for the rest of their lives, always remembering the homeless man who had taught them the true meaning of love on their wedding day. As the months passed, the bride and groom found that the unexpected moment at their wedding continued to resonate deeply within them. Their everyday lives were infused with a new sense of appreciation for the people and relationships that surrounded them. They were more mindful of the connections they had, and it seemed as though the lessons they had learned that day were constantly unfolding in small, meaningful ways. One evening, not long after the wedding, the groom found himself on the phone with his old friend, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. Their lives had taken different paths, and they had drifted apart, lost in their own routines. But after the homeless man's speech, the groom realized that life was too short to let old connections fade away. With a smile, he dialed the number, unsure of what kind of reception he'd get, but certain that he wanted to make the effort. "Hey, it's been a long time," the groom said when his friend answered the phone. The conversation flowed naturally, and it wasn't long before they were catching up on everything they had missed. The groom was surprised by how easy it was to reconnect, how much they still had in common despite the time that had passed. He smiled to himself as he realized how simple it had been to break the silence. And that was when he understood. Sometimes, it's the small things, the simple moments of reaching out, that truly make a difference. Meanwhile, the bride had been working on mending relationships within her family. She had always felt a deep love for them, but there had been moments of distance, small misunderstandings that had piled up over the years. She found herself reaching out to her sister, a conversation that had been long overdue. They talked about everything, memories of their childhood, the changes in their lives, and even the things that had caused tension between them. By the end of their conversation, they both felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. "Why didn't we do this sooner?" her sister had said with a laugh. "We've been holding on to things that don't even matter." The bride agreed, realizing how often she had let time and small misunderstandings get in the way of her most important relationships. But now she felt as though she had found a new sense of clarity. The man's words had given her the courage to address the things that had been left unsaid and to take action in restoring her family ties. Their friends, too, began to notice a change in the couple. They seemed more present, more connected, and more willing to engage in meaningful conversations. It wasn't that the couple was doing anything dramatic. Rather, it was the small, intentional efforts they made to nurture the relationships they had. Whether it was sending a message of appreciation or just taking the time to truly listen, their interactions became richer, more genuine, and more fulfilling. The couple also found themselves more focused on the community around them. They began volunteering at local shelters, offering their time and support to those in need. The homeless man, though no longer a part of their lives, had left a profound impact on them. His message about the value of human connection had made them realize that there were so many ways to give back, to make a difference in the lives of others. They didn't need to wait for a moment of inspiration. They could make a positive impact every day, no matter how small. As the seasons changed and life continued, the bride and groom carried with them the lessons they had learned from that unforgettable wedding day. It was a quiet reminder that love isn't something that can be planned or controlled. It's something that grows organically, in the spaces between the words, in the simple acts of kindness, and in the moments when we truly see and appreciate one another. And while the homeless man may never have known the lasting effect of his words, the bride and groom understood that his message had transformed their lives in ways they could never have imagined. Their wedding, a day that was supposed to be about them, had become a lesson in love and human connection for everyone who was there. The man had not only changed their wedding, but had also changed their hearts, leaving behind a legacy of compassion, understanding, and a renewed appreciation for the people they held dear. Years later, when the couple looked back on their wedding day, they didn't just see it as the beginning of their life together. They saw it as a turning point, a day when their hearts were open to a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. And every time they shared the story of the homeless man who crashed their wedding, they did so with a sense of gratitude, knowing that the most meaningful moments in life are often the unexpected ones.